From the halls of their great house, there are assembled three who hope to one day be the world's greatest driving heroes. Created from the cosmic legends of the universe comes our team captain, the Vision, Bill Fisher, their soon-to-be Wonder Woman, Vicky Fisher, and our Batman, the master of tools, gadgets, and all things mechanical, our mild-mannered soon-to-be millionaire, Alan Danvers. Their mission: to fight injustice, share what is right and wrong, to get you out of your house and come out racing with us and serve all mankind. They are the Garage Heroes in Training team.
Welcome to the Garage Heroes in Training podcast. I'm going to be one of the hosts for this episode. My name is Bill. Who else is hosting?
I'm Vicky.
You are. And Vicky, we have a guest. We have a guest who has his own podcast. It is creatively called the Slick Talk Podcast, which is not anything to do with hairstyles. Nothing at all. This is a gentleman who...
I know. I'm looking at the hairstyle.
No,
He's got quite the nice hairstyle, too.
It could be a subset of his podcast. I think that would be a Woot episode. Because his traditional topic is not hairstyle. But he has the professional setup rig, which nobody can see because this is an audio podcast, but that's okay. He works at Blackstone Laboratories. Everybody who listens to our podcast probably knows them as the place they send their oil in to see what's wrong with our car, because we never send it in to see what's right with our car. But that's just it. So, hosting of the Slick Talk podcast, Blackstone Laboratories knows all the way around a spectrophotometer, I am sure. We have Joe Adams to the podcast. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Spectrophotometer, how about that? Yeah, a little bit.
Hey, I'll add it to my business card promptly. So
there you go. Very well.
Make sure you include the hairstyle.
That's right.
I thank you for plugging that as well. You know, you're ahead of me on that. So
no worries. We have what we call our Woot episodes, because you can tell by our name we like heroes. So we do the most of the superhero movies and TV shows. So we have Woot episodes, which are way off our topic. So if you want a Woot episode on hairstyles, you are prepared, sir. I still have some, so I could have a hairstyle, but that's, elective surgery on my age. So just in case people aren't familiar with your background, Joe, would you care to do a better job than I do with an intro?
Yeah, so I started at Blackstone Laboratories in 2017. I joined them as a data analyst, and that's still what I do most of the time. I'm checking oil and looking for problems with engines and transmissions. But importantly, over the years, we've kind of expanded that role into social media, podcasting, really spreading the good news of oil analysis any way I know how. That's really inspired by my communications experience at Indiana University and paired up with the knowledge of Blackstone. So becoming a petrol head has been something I didn't know was going to happen, but sure did. And I'm glad it has, because fitting into the world of used oil analysis has really been perfect for me over the years. So I'm glad to be there.
So apparently you haven't been sucked into the black abyss of racing, but we're going to work on that throughout this episode. We apologize.
Well, the high RPMs are there. They just kind of are relegated to the Pontiac Sunfire and Chevy Silverado and other vehicles that unfortunately found their way in my possession.
Those sound like excellent bad ideas. So you may fit this right in with everybody else that we know. So that'll be great. Well, thank you for coming on. So we thought we'd start with kind of an overview or an intro to oil. I, with my materials background, would really like to get into this in detail, and Vicky, with her art background, says, Bill, you better not. So oil is kind of, I think next to tires, probably the most abused material in a race car. It's designed for something that we may not be doing to it, because most cars aren't subjected to the fun that we choose to exert upon them. But kind of go over a little bit of what the oil's doing and what it was designed to do, and how in a racing environment we may be doing things that the oil is just going to surrender to.
Yeah, so the oil is there to clean and lubricate the engine. And in the process of doing so, it's going to accumulate metal And also the physical properties can shift somewhat. So, when you think about racing, you think about high RPMs, you think about the effect heat can have. And if oil is exposed to excess heat, you might see differences in things like the viscosity and how many solids are present. We measure these things in our standard analysis. So talk about solids in our line of work, that's referred to as insolubles. So that's the oil solidifying, and that process can be accelerated when it's exposed to excess heat. Of course, excess heat isn't always a byproduct of racing. It can occur, though. So we appreciate it when customers note, hey, the oil temperatures are reaching, well in excess of this amount of Fahrenheit compared to, the 210 degrees that most engines are getting up to around operating temperature. So you'll see some impact on the physical properties depending on the conditions. And what we want to do is see how the engine is responding to those conditions, both from a wear standpoint and see how the oil is holding up. And that's all contained within the realm of just our standard analysis.
So, what do you think the grade? What are the grades sold? Is spending money on better oil worth it?
So when you get into price point, I think that there's a lot that goes into it that is relevant, albeit not terribly essential, when you talk about the differences in performance from a couple of key areas. So we want to know if the engine's wearing well. So we want to go to the wear metals. We don't see an appreciable difference between the various brands or blends when it comes down to engine wear. Now, a lot of people take that to mean that there is no difference between like AMSOIL or Royal Purple or whatever. That's not the case. There are very significant differences in terms of manufacturing, additive recipes, the levels of certain elements, and of course the process in which they're made. There are differences between those brands, but when you talk about, should I be spending top shelf price for my engine to be wearing better than it would otherwise, we just don't see that key difference. It's pretty rare to see a noticeable shift in the wear profile of an engine. So from that standpoint, you don't need to be spending X amount of dollars just to ensure that your engine is going to respond well to the use it sees. However, there are differences that people take into account. Some people are really obsessed with, the amounts of phosphorus and zinc for flat tappet engines. Some people want to have a certain amount of calcium or magnesium. I mean, there are differences there. But yeah, if you want to strictly know that your engine's going to be taken care of, you can rest easy by following an API certification, running the correct weight, and to go from there, you just need to make sure that that engine is actually a good fit for what it's being asked to do. Oil is not going to suddenly make a Corolla fit for drag racing. It's not going to suddenly make a semi, perform like a vehicle that's not being asked to haul heavy loads. So really, you need to make sure that what you're asking that engine to do, that's really well equipped for it, rather than just saying, well, what do you mean? I put in AMSOIL with a 25,000 mile guarantee. Why doesn't it look great?
So back before there was this thing called the internet, you learned everything from your friends who knew everything about everything, especially in high school. And one of my friends, who was the resident auto dude, obviously I should have listened to him more, perhaps has led me astray. His introduction to the 10W40, which was the predominant oil at the time, was that it was 10 stood for the weight, which is what the W stood for, and 40 stood for viscosity. So it was a 40 viscosity. I don't know what units that was. I believe I've come to the understanding that my friend knew less than he thought he did. Is that true?
Yeah, so the two different values there, you have the viscosity at low temp and high temp. So starting out, it's thinner and then it thickens up as it reaches the operating temperature. So, there is such a thing as a 40 weight, a straight weight, and then there's a 1040. Those multi-vis oils, you'll see that shift in viscosity based on temperature.
So a 10 W40 is 10 viscosity at low temperature and 40 at high.
Yeah, it's going to thicken up as
Okay.
it's warmed up.
Same thing like I've seen 0 W30s, basically it's like a hodgepodge of numbers. You see 10s, now you see 5s, even multiples of 5. So it has nothing to do with weight and viscosity. It's more high temperature, low temperature in the traditional sense for viscosity.
Yeah, you're gonna see that shift. It's obvious when you're measuring it at low temp and high temp. What confuses a lot of people is like they'll send in a what they think might be a 5W30 or a 0W30, and they'll ask us, well, yeah, you should be able to tell these apart. And it's like, yeah, there would be an appreciable difference if we're measuring they're cold, but when they're actually reaching that temp, you see about the same measurement, which makes sense. We're testing the high number, not the low number. So yeah, there is that difference.
Okay.
What about street driving versus track driving and the demands on the oil?
Yeah, so what you'll want to pay attention to is how much metal the engine's putting in the oil. So generally, engines, well, first of all, it all comes down to intervals too, how much you're asking the oil to do. So like if you have a daily driver, which this happens to us a lot, we'll see like a lot of like Subarus, for example, there'll be a person's daily driver and then they'll mix in like a couple track days. Mm-hmm. If the engine's handling the track use well, and also can be kind of tricky when we are being told that they're taking to the track, well, how much are they doing at the track? What all is involved in your track day versus another person's track day. But to back up, we might not see an appreciable difference if you're talking about like a 4,000 or 5,000 mile interval. Then you say, well, I mixed in a track day. That engine's wear profile might look like pretty casual. Whereas if you take someone who's only doing track use, you'll likely see the engine contributing a lot more metal in a quicker amount of time. Now, the demands on the oil, that speaks to how much metal is there, which can affect its ability to clean and lubricate. So the more metal that's present, the less able the oil is to do its job. So we want to pay attention to how much metal is accumulating at what rate. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, we'll want to see if the viscosity is holding up, if there's a lot of insolubles present. So it can very well, for some cases, result in more metal, more solids. Maybe there's a viscosity loss. Maybe there's other issues going on with the physical properties, but not always. So every situation's different. One car that goes to the track a couple days out of its 5,000 mile oil change, you might not see great demands on the oil versus someone who is only going to the track and it's a dedicated track car. Well, then it might be a different story. So you always want to start your file and treat it individually and monitor your trends over time. We talk about what our friends tell us, the people who know everything. Well, make sure that you're not comparing your situation to one that isn't entirely comparable. If you're going to the track every day, but your track use isn't what another person's is, make sure you pay attention to what's different when you're factoring in your maintenance and everything to do with the oil.
Is there anything that we can do with the oil in the car, additives or any particular kind of way to drive to help have it be better?
So that's the good news. I mean, really, aftermarket additives, a lot of the time they're contributing to what's in the oil already. They just don't serve an essential purpose when you're talking about how that oil is going to perform otherwise. Some additives don't even stand out, some do, but at the end of the day, the oil you're buying off the shelf is packed with so much additive already. And when
do you think it's a marketing ploy?
Here's the way I like to answer that. If
like
there
GNC.
if there was an additive that was the miracle additive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think the oil companies would know and would use it?
This is true. I'm just saying, it's like,
eat
well or kind of hit all the Gen Tech, all the stuff you pump in your body when you're doing stuff.
I think that it's a situation now. You will see impacts of them. So I think that's the other thing I don't want to run over it is true that you see impacts of these additives. Like, for example, Lucas, situations where you're trying to slow down a leak, that can help. Situations where you're trying to cover up a noise that you would just rather not hear, but you don't want to fix the problem, that might help. So there are cases where these additives do, look, you can see tangible results. But if there is an additive that would help your engine wear like a champ, an additive that would stop contamination from wreaking havoc that shouldn't be there, I think you can rest assured that it would be in that bottle already off the shelf if it existed, some, insane problem stopping product.
So I think that's the very nice way of saying it's kind of like not repairing your head gasket and just pouring the gasket in the can in. And
I just recently was talking to a family member who was doing exactly that. I didn't have the heart to just be like, well, because everyone's situation's different, and some people just don't want to make the repair or whatever. But I wanted to just say, like, it's close to throwing your money down the drain sometimes.
We do that enough. We don't need any help doing it with coming up with our own oil treatment packages. So we've talked around it a little bit, but we never really got into exactly what the services you provide with Blackstone Laboratories and what you do with the oil or the samples that we send in to you, because I think we can send in more than just oil to you guys if you gladly help us solve potential problems or prevent potential problems, which is even better. So maybe we could go over those just a little bit.
So when you talk about pretty much any system that needs oil to do its job, we can analyze that oil. So if it's engine, transmission, differential, we can analyze all of that, but we can also analyze coolant if you're trying to make sure your coolant is in serviceable condition. But yeah, really anything, power steering fluid, you name it, we can test it and see if it's in the condition it needs to be running in your vehicle. So yeah, it's pretty hard to find a part of the maintenance plan we can't help with in that regard. And for people who are wondering, how much do I need to send you? Our sample bottle is a one size fits all for everything we test, whether it be gasoline, coolants, oil. It's all going to take the same amount of sample size. Prices vary on each of these tests. Feel free to contact us if you're curious about any of that. But the one thing we do the most of, which is the oil, that's a $30 test that will check for engine wear, contamination, and tell you how the oil is holding up.
So it does that through the elemental analysis of the insolubles within the oil?
So the spectrometer is going to analyze various elements, including the wear metals. And then we also use the spectral analysis to identify markers for coolant contamination, excess dirt. Insolubles, that's just a measure of how much solids are present. So when we are running oil through the spectrometer, that's not the actual solids. The solids are separate from that. So the insolubles test is going to tell you how much solid material is present. We measure the viscosity and the flash point to check for fuel and water.
Okay. And there's going to be a few of our listeners who probably aren't going to be comfortable doing the interpretation of the results. So how should they look at those results? Because, some of us, our numbers cause our eyes to roll to the back of our head like a great white biting into a seal. So is there any kind of guidelines or help with the interpretation you could offer?
Yeah, that's really what sets Blackstone apart, is we don't just give people the numbers and say, hey, figure it out. And we also don't give people numbers and say, problem, levels high, iron high. We don't do that. What we do is we provide a narrative with every single report we send out. It's written by an analyst like myself who has been trained to understand what these results mean. And not only that, if you sample with us repeatedly, we build trends for you. We look at how one oil change interval compares to the next. We take into account mileage, makeup oil, differences in the oils you've been running. All of that's taken into account in a paragraph comment where we are identifying what is relevant. We bring up what looks like a potential problem. If there are no potential problems, we talk about, hey, this is what's really looking good. This is what you're doing well. Here is the engine's performance from a wear standpoint. Here is how the oil's holding up. We don't leave anything for people to sit around and figure out. We don't just say, hey, here's the results. No, we take pride in offering an easy to understand evaluation. And that way you can use that comment, but you can also always contact us and speak to the analyst if you have any other additional questions.
So why test and how best to test? Would you say, I mean, referring to the frequency we should do it?
Yeah. So when you're starting off, I would always stress to start off with what you usually do. So sample the oil change interval that you stick with for now. Like, what is your typical oil run? What's the use involved? So let's get that baseline started. Then from there, we'll tailor each and every recommendation. So, if you're a person who's sampling a 2,000-mile interval, let's just say you typically go 4 track days on an oil, 2,000 miles, and send it off. And then we'll see where things go. And if you're interested in going longer between oil changes, we'll see where things stand. Okay, your wear looks good. We aren't seeing any issues with how the oil's doing its job. All right, let's extend that interval out, and we'll take each recommendation like so. Now, once you have a really good trend established, I'm not one of those people who says, oh, you have to sample every time. Don't you dare miss an oil change. It's not like that. If you have a reliable trend and you know what to expect, and you aren't making any modifications, you aren't making any changes, then say sampling every other interval. That's a fine way to do it too. So start off with what you usually do, and then we'll take it from there. If we see the need to shorten an interval, we'll let you know. If you are making repairs, modifications, it's good to sample afterwards just so you know how the engine, transmission, what have you, is responding to that. And then again, building a trend. So every situation's different. I might check on my car every other oil change. Maybe I'll check on it after I have extended the oil change interval and I want to make sure it handled it well. But yeah, it's a case-by-case basis. The baseline analysis, just start with what you usually do. That way you can speak to what was going on. It's not a situation where you're like, well, I generally go 3,000 miles, but this particular interval, I added a turbo and then I did like 10 more events than usual. Well, that's not really the best starting point then. So let's go ahead and go with what you normally do.
So why test?
In short, you find the problems when they're small instead of big. You prevent failures and you look for contamination, issues with wear. We find them before the engine has gone too far. And then also we let you know how the engine or transmission is responding to the changes you make. And of course, when you're structuring a maintenance plan, it's just invaluable to know for sure how that oil performed, how the engine performed. And then you get more money out of an oil change if you want to run longer. You're able to find that coolant leak when, it's not a milkshake color situation. You found it when it was so minor that it didn't cause engine wear yet. When that injector's gone bad because we see a worrisome amount of fuel dilution. Really, the benefits are catching a problem in the early going, and also you can know for sure it's not a guessing game. It's not a, pulling out the dipstick and being like, oh, the oil looks good to me. It's not a situation where you need to have any doubts.
Right.
And it's something where when I walked in the door, I wasn't exactly sure how it would apply, but then seeing so many engines saved later, saving even, engines in my own family, the proof is right there. So yeah, it's hard to beat as a way to know what's going on without actually tearing your engine apart.
So what are some of the things that you can find? What are the elements that you've come across?
So wear metals, those include aluminum, chrome, iron, copper. You'll also see, depending on the metallurgy, tin, silver, etc. When you get into additive elements, for gasoline engine oils, those are primarily calcium, phosphorus, and zinc. You'll also see magnesium. A spectral exam includes coolant markers like potassium and sodium, or you'll talk about silicon for excess dirt and debris.
Mm-hmm.
It's 20 different elements in total, but we use those elements to assess engine wear, look for contamination, additives, the whole nine.
Are you able to kind of determine what areas of the engine that are failing?
Yeah, so each and every metal has a source, and we know where these metals are coming from. So, if you are worried about a bearing issue and I'm looking at like a 2008 M3, then I know where to go. It's going to start with lead. You're going to see copper and tin as a problem is advancing. If you're worried about the cylinders, we're going to go to aluminum, chrome to look at pistons and rings. If you have a Subaru EJ25, you want to know how the bearings are looking, you can get silver from those. So we know the source of the wear metals, and we know what a typical sample looks like because we have really strong averages for comparison. And then we can go from there and see how your engine compares, what those metals are, what's the wear profile looking like? Are we seeing like a tremendous amount of lead that shows a serious bearing issue, et cetera? So we know where the metals are coming from. We also know what a typical sample looks like for any given engine. So that way we can tell you what's going on.
So do you reference the car make or model in the analysis of the results?
Yeah, that's critical. So we base our averages on the engine type. So we're not comparing to, unless you don't tell us what you're sampling, we're not comparing to generic averages. We have them tailored to the engine type, the engine make. So, if you're sending in a Subaru EJ25, we're going to compare to Subaru EJ25s. And that way we can give you the best apples to apples comparison.
Very good.
So let's go with a hypothetical. Let's say there's a race team and they just built a car. Let's say it's an E46 spec E46 car, and they just put everything together, redid the engine, redid everything. So they're going to go and take it to the track and do the engine break-in, and then do testing and tuning, and then they start racing. What would you, if you were the team manager, say you should send me this, and this? Like, do we want to send in the break-in oil sample? Do we want to send in the first? Do we want to establish a baseline right from the beginning? And then how would you say, if I was the grand poobah of this team, what would you do?
I would always want to start with the break-in sample.
Okay.
So it's going to look ugly.
Sure.
But usually, not always, usually.
Mhm.
But importantly, you see where things go from there. So if say you were to forego the break-in sample and you sampled, a couple oil changes down the line, and again, if we're talking about a built engine, maybe you have forged internals or you've done other crazy things. Well, of course not. We appreciate that.
we never break rules and follow exactly what we're supposed to.
So if you send in a couple oil changes after, and you decide not to do the break-in or the next oil change, and say we have some wear levels that are questionable. Well, if we don't have the earlier samples to reference, then I'm kind of lost with not being able to tell you if things have improved, if they've gotten worse, or maybe we're starting to see a wear profile that's normally different from average. So you would kind of rob yourself of the opportunity to see how things are trending. And that way you can know, well, hey, yeah, I have some less than ideal, maybe I have some levels that are above average here, but look across the trend, you can see that things are clearly getting better with each oil change. As we've moved past break-in, we can see that internal parts are maturing well. Well, all of a sudden, you can kind of be at peace with some levels that might not match up perfectly with averages because you can see where things are going. Whereas, if you forego the break-in sample, you kind of lose that opportunity.
Cool.
Do you do other fluids, or is it just the oil?
Yeah, so engine oil, where we can test ATF, gear lube, differential fluid, coolant, gasoline, diesel fuel, all of it. So we have the specs to know where things land. So as long as you can tell us what you're sampling and what it should be, then we can go from there and say, yep, you have a viscosity that meets 75 W90. Wear levels look great for this type of system, so on and so forth. So anything that needs oil to do its job is in our wheelhouse. And then you can also add in things like coolant and fuel.
Okay. So if we were to want to give you the best sample, do we crack, let's say it's oil, do we crack the oil drain plug? Do we take that first drip? Do we go midstream? Do we scoop it out of the drain pan? Do we go to our oils collection where we've got 7 or 8 different oil changes involved? Or what would you say is a good plan?
Yeah, the ideal situation is a mid-drain sample.
Okay.
Now, importantly, sampling the start of the drain is not going to be bad, and neither is sampling the end of the drain. The reason we prefer a mid-drain is you avoid dirt and debris from around the drain plug that would sometimes occur if you sample right at the start. Then at the end, nothing wrong with the oil that's at the end of the drain, but sometimes you end up waiting too long and then you have to include some sample from like a dirty pan.
Mm-hmm.
But the oil holds everything in a nice even suspension. So metals are going to be the same at any point in the drain. There's not a significant difference. You might see a ppm, and when I say ppm, parts per million, you're going to see really slight differences, but not enough. So don't worry about skewing metals. As far as the point of the drain, middle is just the nice way to get a clean sample and one where you're going to fill the entire bottle. As for the engine, ideally don't sample right after starting it. Don't sample right after idling it. If you want to pay special attention to fuel, fuel dilution is going to be a lot more prevalent in samples taken only after idling or right when the engine started. So that way you can avoid fuel dilution as well.
So, are there anything to look out for on the labels or any particular brands that we should be careful of? And I don't want you to, I don't want you to call out brands, but, what about some things that we should really be paying attention to when we purchase?
There's not a whole lot, honestly, beyond an API certification and the viscosity. You want to make sure you're picking the right weight for your engine. If you're one of the people who likes to forego the manual, then that's your thing. But by and large, there's not a whole lot to be wary of. You're not going to break an engine by, using Valvoline 1040 and you were using Mobile One 1040 before. So there's not a whole lot that's going to really be a concern in that area when you're getting something off the shelf. A lot of them, honestly, can be hard to tell apart in terms of additive package because there's not a lot of secrets when it comes to producing these products. People know the elements they're using. People know the levels of these elements. So there's not a whole lot that is hidden. And by virtue of that, there's not a whole lot of risk to take when you're choosing a brand or blend.
So people don't really add bonuses to their oils or anything like that.
There are definite differences in some formulas. So like break-in oils, you'll see a whole lot more anti-wear additive, for example. But other than situations like that, some brands do make their name off of the levels of certain additives. They pride themselves on having X amount of zinc or phosphorus or calcium. But you don't have to worry about too much when you're picking a product these days.
Okay.
So I'm glad that you're sitting down because I've got 2 that you may not be happy about. So we've got an E46 M3, and it uses 10W60, which is a nightmare to find. Is there a way to say, well, I've got 10W60, I'd be fine if I found a 0W60 or a 20W60 or 10W50? Or is that a logical path that should be pursued, or are we going the wrong direction?
It's pretty unusual, but sometimes you will see folks running like even a 5W40, or you'll see 1550 on occasion. It's not like you're going to run a tremendous risk. I don't expect a lot of difference, but by and large, it's pretty unusual to see folks not sampling 1060. But yeah, if it's a situation where you literally can't find a substitute, again, I wouldn't expect anything dire to occur as a result.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be interested in seeing how the engine responds. I would pay attention to see how the wear metals are trending, because truly it's not something we see a whole lot. So that would be an interesting trend to analyze. But I wouldn't expect there to be seismic events occurring in the crankcase just by running a 1550 instead of a 20 or instead of a 1060 for one particular oil run, especially if it's brief.
Okay. So you haven't raced with us yet, so you don't realize how many times we'll break during the weekend. But if we're going to the track and we've got the manual says pick a grade, any grade, doesn't really matter. 10W40 could be 10, whatever, doesn't matter. Is there anything that we should do to adjust to that, because it's a track environment, like it's a race car? We don't drive on the street. We don't really care what it's like when it's more cold, because we would never take it on track when it's cold. But is there something that we should, if it's the first two digits should be higher, or the last two digits should go lower, or are we overthinking? We do that a lot.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think there's really these essential hidden steps that you have to take, especially when you're talking about engines that are really designed to do what you're asking of them. I think especially when you have motors like an M3 is made for the track.
Right.
And so when designing the specs and oil passages and the whole gamut of what goes into designing not only the engines but the specifications for the oil, as long as you're not in a situation where you're asking the engine to do something it's really not designed to do, I think it's safe to consider the fact that the manufacturer is factoring these conditions in to the design. So when I'm dealing with just to take it out of the racing world for a second, like when I'm looking at like an ISB 6-7 liter, and someone will be sure to note, hey, I've been doing 5,000 miles of towing on this run, and we were in the mountains, and et cetera, all good information we like to have. It's not unusual at all to see very low wear and an oil that held up very well, because guess what? That ISB was made to do it. So same thing when I'm looking at Porsches, BMWs. Really, the only times engines can look awful in these conditions is when people are really just asking too much of them, either from a power standpoint or they're taking a 2.0 liter Subaru engine and trying to kill that thing. It's not something where I think you have to take these hidden secret menu steps.
Okay.
So what are the differences between synthetic versus standard?
So the standard dyno oil, it's not, it's a different manufacturing process. So there's the chemical production that goes into synthetic oils. And for that reason, some people believe that synthetic is prone to breaking down because it's not the same dinosaur product. And they'll say that, it's prone to shearing or whatnot, not necessarily. But the differences between synthetic and conventional, it's strictly in terms of how they're produced, not so much how they perform in our experience.
Oh, excellent. Is one safer for the environment than others?
That's not something we can really speak to as far as
Okay.
environmental studies. We don't really perform that. So
Okay.
I'm sure there are people with an opinion on that, but yeah, not
All
us.
right.
What about we've been told two different things by several different people, switching back and forth between conventional and synthetic. Any issues there?
I honestly don't see very many situations where there's any significant difference in terms of how the engine's responding to it. Again, it comes down to how the engine's wearing, and really you won't see much of a difference just from switching back and forth. I've done it. We all do it. And it's something that I think mainly is something where fear is stoked, especially in internet forums and people who are really concerned. But yeah, like I said, there's differences in the production process with conventional and synthetic, but you're still emerging with an oil that's fit to run in an engine with a particular viscosity. That's what matters most, not whether it's synthetic or conventional.
Okay, what about we have a 1974 Capri that we're going to try to run again. And if we still had the original engine in it, I was told never use synthetic in an old engine.
Go ahead and try it.
If
you want. Yeah, when these claims are brought up and argued over, I don't see the supporting evidence that really matters, which is is the engine actually running differently? Is it wearing differently? Is there suddenly a difference in how much metal it's producing per mile? Is the oil breaking down from a physical standpoint? That's what I want to know. And usually when these maintenance tips are thrown around, I don't see them backed by that kind of supporting evidence.
We don't need data to argue. Okay, let's make sure we're on the internet right now. Last one. What if I have two oils? They're both the same 10W, 30, whatever, it doesn't matter. And one says a diesel and one says for a car. Does it matter?
Yeah, so if you're running a diesel oil in a gasoline engine, that can cause issues with the catalytic converter.
Okay.
Now, some people still want to do that. They ignore it, but that is an issue that can arise. So be wary of that. So yeah, there are people who want to use them in the wrong context, but beyond that particular issue, you might not run into anything significant. But yeah, be wary of the diesel engine oil and a gasoline motor for that reason.
But in a racing application, there'll be difference.
Honestly, that's a very niche instance where we might have some instances of coming across it. Running diesel and a gasoline engine oil in a racing environment. We're really
well. They didn't have any at the local store, so you know.
Yeah. That's something that honestly I might not have seen myself, but yeah, I wouldn't have any particular red flag to point out.
Well, I can guarantee some of our listeners have done it, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. You know, got to go. So, as far as the difference between your, daily driver on-road car versus something that you use strictly for track, is there any modifiers, additions, modifications to the use of the oils that we should do, say with the same grade? Probably change it a little more often than 10,000 miles, I would think, but anything beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, as with any engine, you want to see how it wears over time, and you want to be able to adjust your intervals accordingly. So when you have, if it's at the track and all of a sudden you want to see if it can handle more days, or you want to see, if you can run it longer in general, that's exactly what testing is for, is understanding if there's any worrisome change in how much metal is accumulating, how the oil is holding up, and then adjust your interval accordingly. So using a test to see, all right, this clearly no issues, clean report after such and such interval, then I'll think about expanding it. Or if you want to do modifications, you want to add more power, well, it would be good to at least take a peek at the oil and see where things stand. If an engine's truly just wearing heavily and not able to handle what's doing already, then maybe hold off on adding more power, maybe hold off on other modifications. So really testing is the key in understanding where things are at. I think of it like a blood test for the engine. A lot of us do. So consulting that information before either making changes to the way you go about things or using it to see if what you're currently doing is asking too much of the engine or not, because you might want to shorten the interval. You might want to take off some days off of what you're currently doing based on how the engine's responding to it.
So, are there any other topics we may have missed that pertains to endurance racing or track driving when it comes to the oils? Anything that our audience should be concerned or careful of?
She's basically asking, what did we screw up the past 2 or 3 races? It's basically
Yeah.
No, I can't think of anything in particular. It's not terribly common to see it in your line, but the only other test we do that I think a lot of people might be interested in. Beyond our standard analysis, we do run what's called a TBN test, total base number, and that measures how much active additive is remaining in the oil. So that's something that's particularly relevant if you're looking to extend your interval. So if you're one of those people who you might do your normal oil change, track use isn't your everyday thing, but something you mix in every now and again, and you want to run longer on the oil, then adding a TBN to see how much active additive is left is something you might be interested in doing. It's valuable for especially that instance where you want to run longer. So oil is meant to, combat acids. That's one of its jobs. So its ability to do so is going to be dependent on how much of that additive present, how much is active. So a TBN is something you might want to consider as well. It's not terribly applicable if you're one who's going to change the oil like after every 5 passes, say, like regardless, you are not going to run it longer. Then it's not terribly relevant. But for people who want to get more miles and then mix in some fun along with that, then it's something that I would think about.
Well, Vicky's holding a gun to my head in a figurative sense that I am not allowed to ask any more questions, even though I have tons of more questions that I've been told no.
There can always be a part 2.
There can be, but I'm thinking there may be more than one person who, like me, want to know more about the different tests that you do in different oils and everything else. Do you know any place that they could get a lot more detail and a lot more information in this area? Perhaps a podcast, I think.
Yeah, so we have our own podcast called Slick Talk, powered by Blackstone Laboratories. You can just find it by searching Slick Talk on any of the platforms. And in addition to that, you can also just go to our website, which is blackstone-labs.com. So from there, you can find information about all of our tests, what each test does, the information as far as what's contained in each kind of report we send. So you can see report examples, details on testing, and of course, ordering kits, everything you would need. And then if there's topics that you're wondering if we might be well-versed in, so many of those are going to be in our podcast episodes. So if you want to learn more about how we look for coolant contamination, how we find certain problems in certain engines, all of that's going to be contained in our podcast episodes on our website. And of course, you can always just reach out directly if you want. But yeah.
That sounds awesome. I heard a couple of your podcasts, been looking for somebody to talk about oil. Figured somebody who had data and was unbiased and unattached to an oil producer might be a little easier to digest the generalities of what our needs are. And we do appreciate you coming on. If you contact Joe and the team over there at Blackstone Labs and let them know that Garage Heroes and Training sent you, you will get absolutely no discount, but that's fine. But, so Joe, we do thank you for coming on. We thank you for everything you've done, you and your team, the the results. We have used them before. We will continue to use them, and we'll look forward to having you on for part 2, and I get to ask more of my questions. I think he's not here. Shh, don't tell him.
Yeah, absolutely. I had fun. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir.